Well, of course, I had always heard of Senator Pepper. I mean, he was such a legend, but I actually met him personally in 1985 in my role as director of the Institute on Aging at Florida State. I met him on one of his many visits here to Tallahassee when he came at least annually to visit the legislature and speak. And I also met him in Washington at some of the events that were held in his honor. And at that time, we were trying, the senator's staff and the people at the university were trying to raise money to complete the $1 million gift that would create the first eminent scholar professorship at Florida State University, and that was the one that is named the Mildred and Claude Pepper Eminent Scholar in Social Gerontology. And Jill Quadagno was the first holder of that, and she continues to hold that position. Well, the thing I really liked about the senator was his complete energy, his focus, and his drive. I mean, you know, he was such a leader, and as soon as he entered a room, everyone followed. The other thing that just impressed me about him so much was his skills in oration and oratory. He was such a speaker, and always without notes. He could give a coherent speech for 45 minutes and just keep the audience spellbound. One day we were having an event for his predecessor, Governor Collins, who had just turned 80, and Senator Pepper was walking across the street coming from the legislature, and so he dropped in on this birthday party and gave the most wonderful speech, and said that Governor Collins had finally come of age now that he was 80. But he just was so dynamic and so on target with his principles and his values, and he was a wonderful man to be around. I think what defined him were people in need, people who were the underserved, the disenfranchised. The elderly was one of that group, and of course he had been a part of the Social Security and the Medicare, Medicaid policies that were developed by the federal government. But you know, I think any group that was underserved or disenfranchised or didn't have a voice, that was what he spoke for. And I think aging was a big part of that, but I think the poor, the minority groups, there are just so many people that he was champion for. May have been in the early 80s, a little bit before I was formally associated with the Institute on Aging. And so I really wasn't a complete part of that. We were sort of beneficiaries of that wonderful gift, but it emerged and originally was housed in Washington, D.C. I think when things really began to happen is, or at least happened for FSU, is when the foundation was able to move from Washington, D.C. to Tallahassee, and it was a sort of a natural progression, and I think was a very positive thing to have happen. As director of the institute that now holds Senator Pepper's name, I was very closely involved with Francis Campbell, who was looking at space, some of it downtown, to house the Senator Pepper's papers, and so there was also movement on campus for space because there's always a shortage of classrooms and offices and other things, and so I came up with this crazy idea that we should have a triangle of communication and research and public service, that the Pepper Institute on Aging, which would do the research arm, and the Pepper Foundation could be involved in and would communicate and disseminate information out to the general public through various outlets, not only the scholarly outlets that the faculty were involved in, but public outlets as well. And that kind of developed into a need to have an auditorium, and then the need to have a library and a museum. And the Pepper Institute was housed in this little cubbyhole up on the 6th floor of the Bellamy building, so we were just totally outgrowing our space. So I think the most dynamic part of my early involvement was after the professorship was established, was to get the space, and so we constructed the plan for the building, and Frances and I worked together throughout the entire construction. She really took all of the leadership for the museum, and that was funded by private monies through the Pepper Foundation. So none of that was public money, and so it was a great partnership, and it's evolved into a wonderful resource for the whole region, far beyond FSU. Well, I guess I always like to draw little diagrams, and so it just seemed to make sense that and I guess I'm also guided sort of a little bit by systems theory, and so to me it was a system that would make the things that the faculty were doing, the things that the Pepper Foundation were doing, kind of come together. It was only as the building was being constructed that we then also added the third entity, which is the Pepper Center, which is not only the building, but it's also the facility that is headed by Larry Polifka. We designed the building twice because as we had one building totally designed and we were hoping to go into construction the next year, we got a new president to the university who said, sorry, but you're not going to build that building on that lot. So we had to go back to zero. So that was one of the obstacles, and it delayed us for about 18 months. But I think, you know, like anything, institutions mature. And I think initially we were trying to figure out how to work together, and there's always that little natural tendency to say, gosh, you know, should we be doing this? And so, but I think what has happened, that was 85, it's 27 years. And we moved into this building, I believe, in 1997, the Pepper Center. So that's been 15 years. I think what's happened is today we can say that there is a really good mesh and working relationship and good partnership between the three entities, the Pepper Center, the Pepper Foundation, which has provided so much to all of these groups, and the Pepper Institute on Aging. I think everybody knows what their role is, but they also see how when you work together you can maximize those things, and you get more by working together. And so I think that as we look at what's happened over time, that the dream has come true.
And what was the land issue?
Well, I had thought it would make sense if we were going to have a building to have it beside the Bellamy building, because the Pepper Institute and the Pepper Center and the Pepper Foundation were all linked to the College of Social Science, which is housed in the Bellamy Building. And we could even have a bridge at the second floor so that people would communicate, because I think the whole thing is access and people having buildings constructed in a way that facilitate people's communication. So I thought having the two buildings connected would be a good idea. But apparently the president thought it would be a prettier green space. And so it took us a little while, but we found this location. And actually the way the building is designed, when you come up the road, it's quite magnificent. So it ended up being a very pretty site, and I think a good location. It's very centrally located and easy to access, even though parking is always a problem at Florida State. The Pepper Foundation had its funding primarily as a governmental allocation. So it provided the private funds for not only the building, the museum and all of its construction, the things that were needed for the library, gifts to establish the Pepper Center, and gifts to the Pepper Institute for professorships and other things, student scholarships. And so the money has always primarily come from the Pepper Foundation. That's really been the foundation and the core of all this movement and all this success that we've experienced. We did receive monies from one of the friends of the senator called, it's a group called the Eagles, and they were housed on the West Coast, and they funded a professorship which we still use as a visiting professorship in the Pepper Institute on Aging. And of course, the Pepper Institute does its own fundraising, so it does have other generous gifts. But most of the funding and most of the success is really due to the Pepper Foundation. The senator was always there, and of course my involvement started in '85, and we began to do the planning in '87, and then of course he passed away in '89. So while he was very interested and he was so proud of his professor, he always introduced Jill as my professor. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Yeah. But he was very, very proud of her and proud of the things that were happening, but then also he was quite ill the last few months. So I would say that his actual involvement in the construction and seeing his library and museum, that he was not involved much in that. If it had not been for Fran's memory and her records and her notes, we would not have the accurate duplication of his offices and his effigy and all the things she saved over the years. So she really is the reason that the museum and the library are so successful. The reason it's emotional is when we had people like Governor Collins for the state, but Senator Pepper at the state and then national level. These people really took their duties seriously. They felt that they were there to serve. And I think what we see today is people are more self-centered. The politics is not very pretty. I think people in office seem to be driven more by their ability to stay in office, to gain, and to get reelected. And I don't think we see very many public servants who are looking at what is the right thing to do, not only for today, but also for tomorrow and the next generation. He was just such a legend. I mean, his name, everybody, the common people all knew. The common people all knew who Senator Pepper was. He was just an everyday household word. You know, you always want to set your sights higher. So I think that the three groups, the Pepper Center and the Pepper Institute and the Pepper Foundation, are just really working together well. But I don't think that there are very many people in Florida who know about it or who know about the work that's being done. I think, you know, maybe Tallahasseans do. But I guess I'm always looking for a little more visibility, and it's really difficult. How do you make that impact so that you do influence the policymakers, so that you influence public opinion? I don't know how that happens. And I know it's happening to some extent, and I know people are working very hard at it. And I think the fact that his papers are available online so that they're accessible, and the fact that people are out at meetings and trying to be visible, but I think that's the challenge, is how does the work of the foundation and the center and the institute get more into the mainstream? And I guess that will always be a challenge. And it's kind of hard in the political environment that we have today, because that's a very kind of skewed environment, I think. Some of the hurdles were that, you know, people had their old patterns, and people had their job duties. So those are always sort of first, and taking time to figure out a new way to work together sometimes is a burden for people who are busy. But I think it's happened. I just think that it's come together. I think it was a partnership. I think no one person did this. I think Frances certainly conceived the things that happened in terms of the senator's legacy, and she certainly had so much energy and so much knowledge that made that happen. But I think she couldn't do it alone. I think having a wonderful professor in Jill Quadagno, I think having good leadership in both the Pepper Center and in the Pepper Institute, all those things made it happen. I think some of our university presidents, for instance, Sandy Dalembert, during the period that he was president for 9 years, he certainly facilitated bringing the Pepper Center and Pepper Foundation and Pepper Institute into a more visible role at the university, and he was certainly an advocate for getting things done. So it was easy to get things accomplished during his administration. It was just something that I thought should happen because I was there, and you know, it just happened. I think it was. I think that the university obviously wouldn't have invited the foundation to be housed at the university if it hadn't. So I think there was a desire to have the foundation be there and be an active part in what was happening in terms of not only aging policy, but other policies that perhaps could be influenced in a positive way. I served on the board for several years, 3 or 4 years, and it was a really great experience. But the first part of it that was great is I was sitting among people who actually worked with the senator for decades and knew him so well, and so I learned and gained so much just from being among these wonderful people who had spent time with him in his office in Washington and accomplishing the kinds of policy things that he was able to accomplish. They were just totally a part of it, and so they had no question about what his vision was. I think one of the strengths I brought to the board is I knew the university, and I knew how to get things done through this system, and of course Fran knew the Washington system. So it just made a good mix to have, I think, a little bit of diversity on the board. One of the very nice things that happened during the time I was on the board is the board members agreed to expand the Pepper Center resources so that it could do an increased job in terms of doing policy work, getting the word out, and it has done that, I think, with those additional resources. But I think mainly it was, it was mainly the members of the board almost fervently guaranteeing that no one would stray from the senator's dreams and mission and values. And so I think having those members on the board and being able to serve with them, I think that was the real strength, is the ability to really guarantee that his values would be carried out. And I think they have been.